to a new panel on the Conference on the Crisis of Political Representation and the Stretching of Populism, organized by the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. I am Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies, and I welcome you here. Before we start, I want to announce that we will be finishing this remote conference next Friday with two panels, in fact, and those are going to be webinars open to the public. From 12 to 2, we will have a roundtable on populism in comparative perspective, putting Latin America in dialogue with the rest of the world, where we would have Tim Fry, Sherry Berman, Robert Kaufman, and Justin Phillips. So we'll have different areas of the world represented. And then from 2 to 3, we will have a keynote conversation with Saskia Sassen and Jorge Castañeda. So I really urge you to put it in your agendas. It's a little bit longer than the 2-hour format. It's a 3-hour format, but we'll start a little bit earlier. Also, I want to tell anyone, if you are if you're a participant in the conference, you just raise your hands with the raise your hand option for questions. If you are watching us from Facebook Live, please write your question in the comment section, and Monica will send it to me through the chat function. Before I present the panel, I want to thank Monica Trigos and Esteban Andrade, who have been incredibly helpful in making this conference possible. Today, we have panel 3, which is the stretching of populism and its implications. We're moving a little bit to the supply side of populism. And we have a fantastic panel. We have Amy Erica Smith, who's an associate professor of political science, as well as liberal arts and science dean's professor at Iowa State University. And she has been also a Carnegie Fellow from 2020 to 2022. Her research examines religion, polarization, democracy, and authoritarianism in Latin America. We also have with us Ernesto Calvo, who's a professor of government and politics and the director of the interdisciplinary lab for computational social science at the University of Maryland, College Park. His research on political representation, elections, and Congress has received the Lawrence Longley Award, the Luber Award, and the Michael Wallerstein Award from the Representation section, the Comparative section, and the Political Economy section of the American Political Science Association. At the third panelist is Ken Robert, who's the Richard Schwartz Professor of Government at Cornell University. He studies comparative politics in Latin America with an emphasis on the political economy of development and the politics of inequality. His research explores the intersections of political parties, populism, labor, and social movements in Latin America. He's particularly known for his research on social protest against free market economics reform previously adopted in Latin America. And finally, we have as a discussant Professor Eduardo Moncada, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Barnard College. His research agenda focuses broadly on the political economy of criminal violence, and he's the author of Cities, Business, and the Politics of Urban Violence in Latin America, and the co-editor of the edited volume Inside Countries, Subnational Research in Comparative Politics. It is a pleasure to have you all. If you don't mind, we can follow the order in which I present you and give each of you 10 minutes since we have read the papers, and then open for a conversation. So Amy.
All right, thank you so much, Vicky, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted to be with all of you guys. I've learned so much from listening to your presentations and reading your papers. And I'm really excited for the discussion today as well. All right, so I have too many slides for a 10-minute presentation because I cut down a presentation that was originally 30 minutes to a 10-minute presentation, and I didn't cut enough. So I'm going to present my slides, but I'm going to focus on ideas and less on methods, and I'm going to try to connect my paper to populism, because the paper that we submitted doesn't include the word populism in it, and it's on a workshop about populism. So I'm going to try to talk about the ways in which what we're talking about relates to populism. And I think it ties to Ken's paper in particular. Okay. All right, here we go. And Here we go. All right, so this is a paper co-authored with Taylor Boas, with whom I have done a lot of previous work on religion in Latin America as a whole, religion in Latin America and in Brazil. Okay, so we're going to start by situating our paper in the context of Costa Rica's 2018 election, which those of you, many of you may remember, the 2018 election was really an extraordinary election because it was upended by a court ruling from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which about a month and a half before the first round of the election came down with a ruling requiring the legalization of same-sex marriage, sort of legalizing. I mean, it's a supranational court, but legalizing same-sex marriage or requiring the legalization of same-sex marriage in Costa Rica, which upended the race in a kind of extraordinary way. So immediately, all the candidates had to take a position on the ruling. And we have some candidates, some of the leading candidates took sort of mushy middle ground, I like it, I don't like it kinds of positions. And two candidates came out as really strongly in favor or against the ruling. These two candidates who came out one really strongly in favor and the other really strongly against the ruling, ended up polarizing the race and drawing voters to themselves. So what we see is this is a messy graph. The important point is that the little blue and the little yellow line dramatically rose in the lead up or in the final weeks of the election. So the little yellow and little blue lines are candidates who were initially not particularly strongly favored in the election, and suddenly their fortunes take off as soon as they take strong positions for and against the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruling. We end up with a far-right evangelical pastor who had who had been really kind of minor on the political scene, and though he head of a minor political party, suddenly come in second place and ultimately lose in the second round of the election. And in post-election surveys, we find that attitudes on values were some of the strongest correlates of vote choice in the election. So the paper deals with a question: why do religion and attitudes towards some same-sex marriage suddenly become prominent in some times and in some places? So we have, for instance, the most famous example of such a rise is Brazil's 2018 election, in which Jair Bolsonaro suddenly won the election. But we have many instances that are similar to this across Latin America, and yet in other places we find materialist issues, things such as crime and the economy, remain the dominant issues in other locations in Latin America. So prior research had suggested that these kinds of what we might call post-materialist issues were weakly linked to voting behavior in Latin America and mostly didn't matter. In fact, some of my own prior work based on 2012 Latin America's barometer data had suggested that these attitudes were weakly linked to voting behavior, and also that religion was weakly linked to voting behavior. So human development theory would suggest that these kinds of what we might call post-materialist issues would become increasingly prominent in as human development progresses. And we suggest that the pattern we see in Latin America is broadly consistent with the notion of human development theory, where we see these issues becoming prominent in the more developed countries of Latin America. And these issues are less prominent in the countries with lower levels of development in Latin America. And at the same time, we see them also burst onto the scene in sort of spectacular fashion suddenly in ways that aren't consistent with a slow secular progress toward increasing human rights. So we argue that we accept the human development premise, but we argue that in particular that these enter the agenda in Latin America when elites and social movements place these issues on the agenda, and that new issue cleavages are able to develop after new cleavages in the electorate develop in response to the elites and social movements who are the first actors. So, oh yeah, and this happens through legislative and judicial battles, and then ultimately through candidate polarization, which must take place as a result. Okay, so what does this have to do with populism? So the word populism doesn't appear in the paper. We can think of populism, or I accept the notion of populism as a, quote, thin ideology. If we think of populism as a thin ideology, it can be grafted onto all sorts of ideological positions, as Ken Roberts shows really well in his paper. It can be grafted onto left-right economic positions. It can be grafted onto what he calls the high-low economic dimension as well. And in this case, sexuality politics can be one of the issues that is grafted on onto which populism can be grafted. And what we argue is that when sexuality politics rises on the agenda, then we can see the sort of mobilization of religious groups around these issues. And that under these circumstances, religious groups become involved in elections in a way in which they have not been previously. And under these circumstances, this is not part of the argument of the paper, but I think that the extrapolation from it is that religious groups can come to define themselves as a pure and morally pure people, in contrast to a corrupt elite, which would include social movements, which would include progressive elites, who are forcing these sexuality politics issues on the agenda, as well as international organizations, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights would be just one example of the ways in which the IACHR is being portrayed in these movements as an outside corrupt elite force, which is forcing these kinds of issues onto the pure people of, in this case, Costa Rica, or of Latin America in general. Okay, so our paper. So we, very quickly, our paper specifies 3 hypotheses. We hypothesize that when sexuality politics issues are more salient, views on those issues will be more strongly linked to vote choice. So we use a conjoint experiment. We use a conjoint experiment to assess this hypothesis. And likewise, that when sexuality politics are more salient, religiosity and evangelical religious affiliation will be more strongly linked to vote choice. And then we also look at candidate positions. Sorry, this is where we use the conjoint experiment. We look at candidates staking out opposing positions on sexuality politics issues. Okay, so first we use a conjoint experiment. Very briefly, we find that the impact of voter congruence with candidates, that when candidates do take opposing positions on these issues, and candidates often in Latin America don't take opposing positions on these issues, but when candidates make salient their views on abortion, abortion is just as important as the economy or crime in voters and vote choice in Latin America through a series of, we show this through a series of conjoint experiments. Then we run some multi-level linear models that look at how news coverage on abortion and on same-sex marriage shapes the relationship between voter attitudes and voter religion and their vote choice. And what we find is that when abortion is salient in the news, and especially when same-sex marriage is salient in the news, which largely happens through legislative battles, when abortion and same-sex marriage are salient, we find that voters tend to vote for the left, for the right. Or, sorry, religious voters tend to vote for the right. Okay. All right.
Already
so
more than 10 minutes, Amy.
Okay.
So
all right. So I'm going to stop talking now. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking now and leave the rest for a discussion later.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Who was going to go next? Ernesto, were you next?
Yes. So 25 minutes, no?
No, 10. And you know I am pretty draconian.
So anyway, I'm going to try to make this focus, given that there's not that much time. The title of the talk should be Populism by Popular Demand. So going to what Vicky was saying, we can think that leaders, populist leaders, are producing the image of a charismatic leader because of their attributes, but we could also think that voters are interested in creating populist leaders. And in my view, Trump is a populist, for example, by popular demand. It's not supplying charismatic leadership that is then taken by the voters. He was there. The voters had 10 people they could select. They selected him. When we think about Bolsonaro, I have the same impression. Bolsonaro is a populist by popular demand. He's not really creating the mystique of a populist leader. And the issues that are being raised all the time when we think about to what extent populist leaders cultivate this image or are the result of this image imposed onto them is, do voters actually believe on those traits? So we've been doing a lot of things with the lab, trying to figure out to what extent people believe fake news. And not in the sense of, for example, whether they think that the information is truly false. We don't think that they believe the information is false. We think that most Republicans know that the election was lost. They say the election was lost, but they don't believe it. And the reason that they say it is that there's a collective response of, I wouldn't call it cynicism because it's instrumental, in which the demands that are imposed today produce utilities that can be assessed in the future. So we carry this type of discussion to the analysis of the COVID pandemics in Brazil, in Mexico, and in Argentina. And the way in which we think about the COVID in all three countries is the following. There is plenty of information, and in our own survey, we get exactly the same results, that partisans do not perceive the risk of becoming sick or the risk of losing their jobs to the same degree. So, for example, this is Brazil, and these are supporters of Bolsonaro, and these are supporters in red of Haddad, and these are supporters of the independence, the other candidates. We have both first round and second round of the election. And one of the things that, of course, everywhere we find is that, if you think how they deal with the COVID pandemics, supporters of Bolsonaro think that he did very well, opponents of Bolsonaro perceive that he did very poorly, and the independents are somewhat low in the middle. And this is standard in all the cases that we analyze. In Mexico and Argentina, it's relatively the same. But the big question is not that. The big question is, why would they have different expectations of losing their job and becoming sick with COVID? And in this case, the question is presented, and this regression that you're seeing is controlled. So we know that we are matching voters here. We know that basically this is the same people. However, those that are voting for Bolsonaro, they have perceptions they could lose their job that are lower, and they have perceptions of becoming sick that are lower compared to Haddad and to independents. And the way in which we make the joke about this is when the politicians say achoo, when they say salud, the voters sneeze. So the causation is here reversed. They perceive themselves to be sick when they understand the political message that being sick is not just a probability, but it's also an identity. Now, the question that we have here is that there are two things that are going on. The response to the COVID is both an identity response because they understand that they're supporting the government and the government is minimizing the problem with the COVID and they think there's going to be lower unemployment, etc. And therefore they put the shirt and they express the identity, the partisan identity that is being conveyed by the government. But the other one is that when they see the government and they are indicating to what extent there is a COVID risk on employment or on health, they internalize that information and they truly believe the information. And the question that I think is the most interesting and most problematic is to what extent people assimilate this as information, to what extent they understand this as a partisan issue. And that's why we are managing in most of the surveys the shock that has to do with effective responses and the shock that has to do with information responses. So in the case of the analysis of COVID in Brazil, and this is one, I think the trust experiments, we have another experiment with trust, shows a bit more of this. I'll try to fit a bit on the end, but we don't have much time. So what we did is we supply respondents, we divide them in 4 groups, and we expose them to different frames. So we have frames in which Bolsonaro, sorry that I couldn't find the other proposal. We have frames in which Bolsonaro we have frames where Bolsonaro attacks the PT and accuses them of hampering the response, and therefore we have a negative message by Bolsonaro. And then we have also positive messages from Bolsonaro, where he says, you know, we have to deal with the COVID by reaching out, by working with the PT. And we have negative messages by Haddad, in which Haddad is reaching out to Bolsonaro, saying they need support. And we have also the positive message of Bolsonaro, which is reaching out, and the negative message of Bolsonaro, where he's criticizing the government for damaging the response. So what we try to see with this is to what extent, when we shift the frame, the perceptions of risk by voters vary. And we've been doing this, as I was saying, with different dependent variables, and with trust and with COVID and with misinformation. And in all the cases, you have a very clear interpretation when you produce a negative message or a positive message. People understand very clearly the partisan content of the messages. So if I, for example, put the message from Bolsonaro, I know that there's a part of a response in which they retweet Bolsonaro. This is a larger retweet, and this by Bolsonaro voters, and they retweet Bolsonaro messages, and they're retweeting both the positive and negative messages to a larger extent that they do the Haddad messages. And we find that they retweet much more often the positive Haddad and the positive Bolsonaro than the negative Bolsonaro and the negative Haddad. So we know that they understand the partisan content of this. But what we try to distinguish is to what extent, when you expose them to these different partisan contents, the response that they get is an identity response on the probability of becoming sick. So, just to give the intuition for the analysis, what we have is that individuals are responding to the partisan component, and when we can distinguish those that get angry or those that engage with information, perceptions of risk become more partisan in one direction or the other. So we have sometimes failings into what extent they interpret the frame properly, and they get angry with the frame. But when we isolate the anger effect that it produces a tweet, we get that those persons indicate that they are more likely, for example, to get COVID. The same happened when we think about Haddad voters. Now, when we think Haddad voters, we had the intervention in the middle of the survey of Bolsonaro's speech. And when Bolsonaro gave a speech, Haddad voters, immediately after the speech, they reported higher probability of becoming sick. And again, the bigger question is to what extent that reflects information that Bolsonaro is not going to act on the COVID crisis, or to what extent is a partisan response. I can talk a bit more about how you can identify that. There's a beautiful experiment that they did with the inauguration of Trump, where they show that as the intervention is implemented, those that are partisans are more likely to react as education goes up. And when the issue that is at stake is, on the other hand, the kind of uninformed populist trait, the uninformed voters and the less educated voters are the ones that react. So the big question that we are modeling now is to what extent, when you have these interventions, the probability of sneezing, the individual that perceives that is more likely that they're going to get COVID, is the more informed or the less informed voters. You expect more informed voters to be less sensitive to the shock, and therefore less likely to change the position and the expectation of becoming sick, compared to the less informed voters. But you expect the more informed voter to be more partisan. So when the shock of the information produces a larger jump on the informed voters, you know that the effect is more partisan. And when the effect of the intervention produces a larger shock in the informed voters, you know that what you're measuring is the information content. So in a way, going back to the beginning, I think that it's important to have as a discussion the problem of to what extent populist leadership is top-down or is bottom-up, to what extent you have populists by popular demand, and therefore to what extent informed voters react to COVID because they want a populist leader, Or to what extent uninformed voters react to COVID because the populist leader is creating an image to which they identify. And I think that those two processes are extremely different. And I think that the notion of a kind of a stupid populist voter that is confused by the message of the leader does not cover properly the fact that in most of these populist events, we have high education, like the ones that interrupted in Congress in the US, high education informed voters that appear to be the most sensitive to the populist information that is put in front of them. So a lot of work, I think, needs to be done to calibrate when we're talking about information, when we're talking about partisanship, when the populism is coming from below and when it's coming from above. Thank you. Sorry, I'm going above the limit. You're muted, Vicky.
Sorry, Ken. Thank you, Ernesto.
Okay. Well, thank you, Vicky, and I thank ELOS for organizing this series of conversations about populism and giving me a chance to participate. It's been a very interesting set of seminars that we've had, so I've enjoyed the conversations a lot. Let me see if I can pull up just a couple of slides here that I have and get this from the beginning if I can. Okay, so I've got a paper here that I essentially wrote up as I think you might say kind of a conceptual piece because of some ways in which I was struggling to try to make sense of the relationship between populism and polarization. Because I think we often have in mind when we think about populism, we think about it as being a very polarizing political phenomenon. And in fact, you often find polarizing descriptors being used to identify populism. So we talk about the far right or the far left. We talk about the radical left or the right. We talk about extremists. So those kinds of adjectives are often used to refer to populist leaders or movements or parties. But I think that oftentimes there are different things going on and people have rather different things in mind when they think about polarization. So I think ultimately there are multiple dimensions of polarization that often tend to get conflated together. And I think it makes sense for us to try to give a little bit more thought to the different dimensions and to try to understand the analytical distinctions that exist between the different dimensions of polarization. So what I've done in this paper is to try to identify what I think are three different dimensions of polarization that all become potentially are part of the populist phenomenon. And they argue that one kind of polarization is really constitutive of populism itself, and that that populism always has that particular type of polarization. I argue that the other kinds of polarization are more secondary. But essentially what I do in the paper is I start by talking about what I call constitutive polarization, which is where populism is reducing the pluralism in the political arena and in some ways condensing the pluralism so that what you end up is a binary divide, right? Populism always distinguishes the political arena or cleaves the political arena into two different camps, right? The camp of the people and the camp of the elite. And all of the other distinctions and cross-cutting cleavages and interests and things that might exist within the political arena tend to get relocated onto one side or the other of that basic divide. So I argue that this constitutive polarization is really definitional of populism, and it's really the primary element of populism, without which I think you're probably not talking about populism, right? So any phenomenon that is genuinely populist tries to bring about constitutive polarization of dividing the political sphere into two camps. Right, another understanding or dimension of polarization, which I think is really more intuitively and more widely recognized, and I think it's not always part of populism, but I think it often is. And this is spatial, or what you might think of as ideological or programmatic polarization. All right, but essentially this is where populist figures are outflanking mainstream political parties in terms of the kinds of ideological or programmatic stance that they take. So they're taking more radical positions on the issues, either politicizing issues that were not politicized before, or taking more radical positions on the polls than the positions taken by mainstream political parties, right? So in a spatial analogy of politics, this would be spatial polarization on the issue dimensions. And then finally, a third dimension that I talk about is what I call institutional polarization. And this is a polarization, and in particular, some of the work of McCoy and Summer, who've been talking about polarization. They talk about pernicious polarization. And I argue that institutional polarization, where it exists, tends to become pernicious, and in some ways it becomes existential, because this is polarization around the institutions that are set up to try to manage conflicts. And so you get this where populist figures or anti-populist figures, because I think it's important to recognize, in fact, there's more work being done, more and more people looking at sort of the logic of anti-populism and what a powerful sentiment that can be, and often a polarizing sentiment in its own right. All right, so populism tends to generate very strong cleavages, and oftentimes those become conflicts over the institutional rules of the game, so that in a democratic arena, you have one set of actors or the other that are very consciously using the democratic levers and institutional checks and balances for partisan purposes to try to gain advantage in the political arena. Okay, so I argue that where polarization begins to affect adherence to the institutional rules of the game, it tends to metastasize and intensify in important ways. Okay, so ultimately then, in looking at these three different dimensions, I come down to an understanding of polarization. I say polarization can be conceptualized as the binary division of society into antagonistic political camps. So that's the constitutive element of populism. These camps then are pushed further and further apart. So that's the spatial element of polarization. And then they are increasingly contesting the institutional arrangements that manage their coexistence. And so that's the institutional component of polarization. All right, so those are the three different dimensions. I talk a little bit about each of them in the paper and what they consist of. I talk about, for example, with that not all populism is polarizing spatially. You get populist phenomena such as the 5-star movement in Italy, which constructs that binary divide between the people and the elite. But it's not a radical polarizing political party in terms of its stance on the issues. It draws a little bit from the left, a little bit from the right. It's very difficult to locate a movement like the 5-star in ideological space, or you think historically Argentine Peronism, almost impossible to locate ideologically in space. So I think you can find some populisms that are not defined in terms of ideological radicalism in those spatial terms, but all populisms divide the political arena in that binary way. So that's why I argue that that's really the most fundamental or the primary dimension of polarization, whereas the spatial polarization and the institutional polarization are quite common, but they're not necessarily intrinsic to populism. This figure that I have here, just in terms of thinking about the spatial dimensions of polarization, for me, it's impossible to understand populist polarization spatially in unidimensional space. I can only understand populism in at least two-dimensional space, but so I argue that there's a cultural axis, and there's a lot of work on this in the European context. I think in American politics, for whatever reason, they insist on trying to map everything onto a single continuum, which I think does not work. And so I think the European literature is much more helpful in trying to understand the two-dimensional space of competition. And I think for understanding what Amy Erica was just talking about, with the politicization of religion and sexuality, those are issues that a populist can politicize on the cultural axis, in particular, sort of the lower pole on the cultural axis, where you have different kinds of cultural particularisms. So a particular identity with race, with ethnicity, with religion, with traditional morality. Okay, those are cultural issues that map onto the lower pole on the cultural axis. The upper pole tends to be more cosmopolitan or universalistic kinds of values. And then on the horizontal axis is the economic axis, where you have a more traditional left or right on the ideological space. So a lot of populisms do locate themselves on one of these axes or the other one. Left populism tends to position itself on the economic axis. So you see in Latin America, the rise of Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, populist figures that politicized the economic pole. In Southern Europe, you get Podemos, Syriza, some examples of this in Southern Europe as well. Other populisms, right-wing populism, tends to play on the cultural axis, on the lower pole of the cultural axis, where different kinds of cultural particularisms are located: race, ethnicity, nationalism, etc. Right. So those are some of the kinds of issues that Amy Erica was talking about, and that's where they would fit within this schema. Okay, so typically then, I argue that populist figures, although they're very polarizing, they don't usually emerge in a polarized context. In fact, I argue that populism tends to thrive where mainstream political parties have converged and where programmatic competition has been weakened, whether it's on the left-right axis or on the cultural axis. And so I argue then, look, I'll go ahead and wrap up, Vicky. I argue that what the populist figures do is that they politicize these issues that mainstream parties have either neglected or where they have really ceased to compete on a particular place in the political space. And so what populism does then is it tends to outflank the mainstream political parties on either the cultural axis or the economic axis and politicizes one pole or another. And so that's how I argue that you get the left-wing populism or the right-wing populism along those axes. I won't bother with this now, but it showed a little bit of the data from the Salamanca parliamentary surveys in Latin America, showing that with the rise of Podemos, the rise of the MVR in Venezuela and the MAS in Bolivia, that you get new parties outflanking on the left the mainstream political parties. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Those are the main points I wanted to convey.
Thank you, Ken. So now we will start the discussion with the comments by Eduardo Moncada. So Eduardo.
Great. So thanks, Vicky. Thanks to Monica and Esteban and everyone at ILAS for organizing this excellent series of talks and the invitation to participate. Thank you to the authors for some really fascinating papers. I enjoyed their chance to read them and to learn from everyone's work. So I'm going to make my comments kind of in the order in which I read them. So I started with Ken's paper and then I worked my way back. So I really like conceptual analyses, right? Because of how important conceptual clarity is for theorization and for measurement. So it was a lot of fun to read this paper because it provides a really nuanced discussion of that relationship between populism and polarization, building on a variety of existing theories, but also empirical analyses, not just from the Americas, but also parts of Europe, including a really neat case study in the appendix of the United States as well. So a couple of questions that arose that might be fruitful for discussion. A first question was about precisely the issue of conceptualization, which is one that hasn't really come across in many of the conversations we've had, even though I think the title of today's talk is the stretching of populism. I guess we can think about that empirically, but we can also think about it conceptually. And at times, I wondered how we might build on the points in the paper to kind of further distinguish between populism and polarization. Because in the paper, populism is sort of treated or conceptualized as a subset of polarization, but I wasn't always clear in reading the paper exactly what are the implications of that kind of conceptual ordering for how we should study populism and polarization. So is populism here, are we thinking of it as an actor, a politician, a political movement, a process of dividing the population along particular cleavages, a particular repertoire of practices that can be used by a variety of political actors and movements to sort and frame populations? As you know in the paper, for example, the constitutive dimension of polarization, that division of populations into binaries, is essentially the same definition commonly used to conceptualize populism. So I think it'd be useful to kind of further discuss the concept and its core dimensions to get some clarity on what we mean here, what's the unit of analysis, and how do we distinguish populism from other cognate phenomena. Second, on figure 1, which diagrams that intersection between economic and cultural axes, I really found it very useful and compelling. And I wonder if it might be worth discussing and expanding in the paper the other quadrants in that figure that are kind of empty at the moment, right? So like the top right that combines cosmopolitan and market orientation, as well as the very top left that combines statism with cosmopolitanism and universalism. So I'm wondering if they're empty because the underlying assumption here is that cosmopolitanism is incompatible with populism, or if there's just more space there to be able to conceptualize and think through those things. And finally, part of the analysis on the implications for democracy it kind of reminded me of the debates in comparative politics from years ago about structure versus agency in discussing regimes, right? So the paper argues that there are these two conditions under which populism threatens democracy, when populists have an electoral base and they question the norms and institutions of democracy. Arguably, we saw that in the US case, which the paper really nicely, again, analyzes in that case study. But I guess I would pose the question, have we or will we see the what you call the inertial self-reinforcing quality of populism take hold in the US? Based on the argument in the paper, we might have expected Democrats to move further toward tactics that bypass the traditional democratic norms and institutional guardrails. And there are still talks about things like stacking the courts, elimination of the filibuster in the US Senate, et cetera. But so far, it doesn't seem like these are changes that Democrats are going to pursue, at least those currently in office. So to me, I wondered how much leadership also matters here, the ability of leaders to push back against demands for more populist tactics from their bases once populism has raised the stakes in the political arena. So I have a lot more comments, and I'll email them to you as well. But in the interest of time, I'm going to shift to the paper by Ernesto. Again, a really fascinating paper. And I want to pose sort of three questions here. The first and broadest question is about the ability of citizens to attribute responsibility, right, for particular policies to a specific political actor or level of government. So in your analysis, you focus on the relationship between citizens and the president, right, the national executive. But in the case of Brazil, how much of COVID-19 policy that in the way that it's experienced by populations on an everyday basis is dependent on the decisions of the president versus other levels of government? So more specifically, if we look at policy responses to the pandemic across Brazilian states and its federal district, there's pretty significant variation in the types and levels of sort of policies that governors have taken in response to the pandemic. And even efforts by Bolsonaro to kind of dismiss the virus and encourage sort of more lax policy responses have come up against pushback, both by governors and even the country's institutions like the Supreme Court. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you think your findings might be influenced by the combination of a weak multi-party system, but also at the same time, the very decentralized nature of COVID-19 policymaking in the country. So might we expect variation in how presidential statements, for example, affect the perceived risks among citizens living in states that vary already in their level of policy stringency? Second here, in your discussion of the social media experiment, you discussed the distinction between positive and negative framings. And you kind of deduce that when politicians use the positive frame, that everyone needs to work together. This provides voters with information that the challenge facing the country is serious, it endangers health and economic well-being, and it makes political enemies seem like potential allies, right? I was wondering if there's a moment in the polarization of politics or the level of polarization in politics when this no longer holds. In other words, is there a level of polarization at even which positive framing would fail to foster a willingness for people to work with people on the other side of the political aisle? And third, I found the analysis of the effects of the speech by Bolsonaro to be really interesting. And I was wondering if you could talk about more broadly on the potential differences that political speeches and discourses might have on citizens, depending on the medium through which they're communicated, right? So if I recall correctly, here the speech was televised, right? Which then suggests that the communication between the president and citizens wasn't unmediated, but instead could have been framed by the media commentators, pundits covering the event. That's very different than the president sort of tweeting directly to their followers, right? It's interesting that in the United States, President Trump often tweeted out the transcripts of his speeches in part because he argued that the media would distort what he was saying through their commentary. So would we expect the effects you find here to vary conditional on the type of media and the degree to which that media directly or indirectly communicates kind of the polarizing message to the citizens? And finally, am I doing on time? Still have a few minutes. The paper by Amy Erica Smith and Taylor Boas, again, a fascinating paper that asks how and when do electoral cleavages emerge in developing democracies. The first question I have here, and this may be, I think it's part of a broader book project, so maybe this may be in part of the broader project, but I guess I was wondering about the causal chain in the process being studied here. Here, social mobilization is theorized to kind of place pressure on elites who institute progressive policies that trigger conservative social movement backlashes, right? And all of that generates incentives for politicians to kind of stake out these opposing political stances. But I was curious to hear more about social mobilization's role here. So I assume they don't drop out of the politics of religion and sexuality after successfully pressing elites, and instead may shift to protecting some of those institutional gains that their initial mobilization yielded. The second question was about whether you find that relationships between individuals' perceptions of democracy in their country and the outcomes of interest matter here. So here I'm thinking about how the framing of these issues, in addition to being often linked to questions of religious affiliation, also tend to be framed in terms of deepening democracy, right? Particularly by progressive activists and social movements and their allies in elected office in the Americas. So while my opponents may frame these issues as threats to democracy that run against popular sentiment, so how might the intersection between support for democracy and religious affiliation or attendance of religious services shape voting behavior in context of polarization? A third related question, which is probably beyond the scope of the paper, but I couldn't help think about it when I was reading it, is the ways in which different religions and populisms might intersect. And this kind of goes back to the issue of the concept, and Amy, at your very first slide was talking about one definition, thinking of populism as sort of a thin ideology that can be grafted onto a variety of things. So in the paper, the focus is on Catholicism and evangelicals, but I'm wondering if we might think about other religions and populism, Islam, Judaism, for example, and whether different religions are more or less amenable to populist framing, or if there's a particular reason why we sort of focus our efforts here, obviously, on Catholicism and evangelicals and their relationships with populist politics. And I'll leave it at there to leave room for discussion. But thank you so much again for the opportunity.
Thanks to you, Eduardo, for fantastic comments. I will give it back like a couple, 2-3 minutes to the authors before opening for the general conversation. And anybody who has questions, please raise your hand with the Zoom option. Amy, do you want to start responding?
Sorry, I was expecting to go third.
Okay, no,
yeah,
can,
so no, it's okay. No, I can go. No,
okay.
I'm sorry.
Right.
I'm sorry. I can go. Sorry. Thank you for these really great comments, Eduardo. Some of them I can't answer right now. They're just food for thought. So the causal chain here. Yeah, that's something that we are working out. That's an issue in this paper. And this paper that is actually you put your finger on the thing that is bothering me most in the theory right now. So what do we think is happening? And where do social movements interact with elites, interact with, social movements shape elite responses, and at the same time, social movements also respond to elite responses. And this is a dynamic process. And then social movements are also interacting with, ordinary citizens and shaping public opinion. So social movements are playing all of these roles. And I would say that for the moment, we postulate them as being involved in all of these processes without a clear causal chain, but it's something that we're still working through. As far as how democratic attitudes shape reaction to these policies, that's a great question. That's such an interesting question, and it's one that, I can't tell you in this particular paper, but in my previous book project, I did look at how religious elites are talking about democracy at the same time that they are talking about all of these, sexuality politics issues, and found that elites are largely, especially elites who would get involved in politics, are effectively reinforcing the democratic system and the democratic rules when they get involved in politics to talk about things like sexuality politics, because they're basically saying that they're investing in the democratic rules of the game in rhetorical and practical ways by taking these roles on. So they're effectively teaching their congregations about how democratic politics works in a way that provides sort of a foothold for their congregations in the democratic process. It's a right-wing politics, but it is a democratic politics that they're teaching about. As far as different religion, populism, really great topic. I think I need to be quiet now, so I think I need to stop. But yeah, that's I could talk about that for a long time. The short answer is I think probably almost any religious identity is in principle potentially compatible with populism. But they must be that they need to be politicized, and they may or may not be politicized.
Thank you, Amy. Ernesto?
Thank you. Those fantastic questions. And let me say, I think we should not treat populism as if it had a 1950s media environment. And we shouldn't assume that populism has a media environment that is different than non-populist regimes. If we think about non-populist regimes, we know that the media environment is fragmented. The book that we're writing with Natalia Ruiz and with Diego Ventura is precisely about network activated frames. We know that in different voters are exposed to different combinations of information. And if we want to distinguish both the partisan and the information effect, we have to figure out to what extent certain, access to certain media regions, participation in certain networks, and the level of education interact. So when, for example, the first example you mentioned, when we consider the speech by Bolsonaro, one of the nice things about the speech of Bolsonaro is that the reach is very general. And that means that the intervention is going through all these different channels. And when we think about network activated frames, it means that, like a Rubik's machine, you send a signal, but only some of those signals are arriving because they go through different roads. Some of them are amplified and some of them are not. When we consider, for example, the Bolsonaro speech, we know that in the network that is in Twitter, that is favored by the supporters of Bolsonaro, amplification is huge. And we know in the other network, the amplification is smaller. When we treat that experimentally, everyone is receiving the same signal. So I think that we need to leverage the fact that populist messages, they go through these different channels and they affect voters that have very different levels of partisanship and information. And we can gain a lot of leverage to know what is exactly reaching these voters and how it is working. So I was putting here an article that we did that just published on digital journalism, where what we want to see is to what extent in Brazil the speeches of Bolsonaro and the amplification of the messages of Bolsonaro in Twitter, to what extent they're being activated, that information is activated by different media outlets. So we know, for example, that Globo, we know that Jornal do Brasil, we know that what is called this fake news media was very, República de Curitiba, all of those have different reaches and they're producing different types of amplifications in different regions of the network. So the populist messages are not arriving to everyone at the same speed. That goes to the first issue that you were raising on responsibility, acquisition of responsibility. I do think I really like the article by Helwig and Samuels that shows that different political regimes have different, yield different levels of sensitivity to economic shocks. We know that parliamentary regimes and presidential regimes, when presidents or prime ministers speak, they do not have the same sort of impact. We should think that different media outlets and the different types of media platforms produce the same kind of differences in to what extent messages are reached. So going back, if we know that media environments are complex, and they are complex for both populist and non-populist discourses, we can measure and we should measure which ones are producing stronger reactions, both in terms of partisanship and in terms of information. And I think it's a huge, it's a theoretical debate with a lot of ramifications, so I'll stop here. But we've been doing a lot on this precisely using Facebook and Twitter because we're trying to see what happens when different publics are receiving messages with different dosages.
Thank you, Ernesto. Ken?
Okay, well, thank you, Eduardo, for a terrific set of comments. Let me just make a couple of points. First, with respect to sort of the conceptual relationship between populism and polarization. And this is something that I've struggled with a little bit. And as I see it and try to treat it in the paper, I argue that populism is intrinsically polarizing. So if it's not polarizing, it's not populist. But I argue that not all polarization is populist. So there are ways of polarizing the political arena on ideological issues that are not framed in populist terms. You can polarize politics along a class divide that is not necessarily framed in populist terms, or along an ethnic cleavage that is not framed in populist terms. But virtually, but populism itself is very, very malleable. And so a lot of other, and as Amy Erica was saying, virtually, I would argue as well that I think any religion can be cast in populist terms and are used as part of a construction of we the people. And I think you can also translate a class division in terms of a we the people. I mean, historically, Unidad Popular in Chile did that in much of their discourse. It was very much a Marxist class-based in its official ideology, but a lot of the discourse was actually framed in populist terms. So I think populism, given its malleability and its ability to be used to construct the people in a lot of different ways, there is certainly a lot of polarizing politics that does take a populist form, but I don't think it's inevitable that it do so. Other elements of what you meant in terms of the four quadrants in Figure 1, for me, it's really fun thinking through those four quadrants and trying to think about, a political system like the United States, where you only have two political parties, and how do the two parties cover the four quadrants? And what you realize is that each party has sort of a natural home in one quadrant or the other, but that then leaves two quadrants where they don't have a natural party, where voters in that quadrant will agree more with one party on the economic axis and another party on the cultural axis. And so those are the quadrants where the political parties are competing. And that's where a lot of the movements, a lot of the dynamics and potential realignments of politics take place as the parties compete in those quadrants, which are not really their natural homes. And so that's Trump adopting trade protectionism, appealing on economic nationalist terms, moving the Republican Party de facto away from its market fundamentalism and on the right side of the poll over to the lower left quadrant. And that's a shift that most of the European so-called far-right parties have made. It's a complete misnomer to call them a far-right, because they're not necessarily on the right wing of the economic axis at all. Many of them have shifted into the lower left quadrant. So understanding where there is vacant space and how parties can move in and out of spaces by politicizing different kinds of issues is part of the secret of understanding populism. And then just finally, the inertial properties of populism and how it plays out in the United States. My sense is that we are seeing tremendous contestation around the rules of the game itself. Obviously, with the Republican Party pushing that in anti-democratic directions, but I think what's more, rather than the Democratic Party in a symmetrical manner pushing in an anti-democratic direction, what I think is more likely is what you see them politicizing sort of the existing constraints on popular democracy within the American constitutional order, and the way in which you can have basically a minority party governing in American democracy, and you see the Democratic Party trying to whittle away at those restrictions. So I think there's an intrinsic contestation now between sort of a dialectical competition between restricting democracy or expanding or deepening it in American politics. But I think there's tremendous contestation around that, on that institutional dimension of the political sphere.
Thank you, Ken. So I'm going to start taking now questions from the audience to continue the conversation, and Alejandro Velasco is the first one.
Great, thanks, Vicky. And thanks all of you for the papers. Really learned a lot. I have a kind of narrow question, I guess, for Ken that stems a little bit from a lot of those excellent comments. And it has specifically to do with Venezuela. I guess I was a little bit unclear in terms of the way that you framed the issue, especially the spatial element of polarization. So if I understood it correctly, you're suggesting that as ADE and COPE move closer ideologically in terms of their policy preferences, and therefore there is now an available space in the ideological spectrum for a left alternative, that Chavez and Chavismo move to fill that space. And that in itself is a manifestation of polarization. But if that's true, then, I mean, it seems to be true, but conceptually speaking, then to me, it sounds like the process is rather one of repolarization rather than a polarization writ large, if what had existed prior were a two-party system, yes, with some alternatives available, but really understood institutionally and practically speaking electorally as a two-party system that presumably had already, polarized the electorate in an ideological way, right? And so I guess my question is if that's the case, then really what are we talking about is a process of repolarization rather than a polarization of the political landscape, which then I guess leads me to a second question, which is something that Eduardo mentioned. Are we really, to what extent are the three frameworks that you describe sequentially aligned? I understand the point that not all polarizations are populist, but all populism is polarizing. And I also understand the point about the spatial availability and filling in that gap. And I also understand the point about institutional realignment. But is there a sequential ordering of those three as well that lead to what, as you mentioned, McCoy talks about as pernicious? Or does it not matter sequentially? Or could we imagine these happening in a different order that lead to different outcomes? I guess I just wondered about the sequential dimension of the three sort of conceptual categories that you introduced. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alejandro. Bob Kaufman. You're muted, Bob.
No, now I'm not, I don't think. Anyway, great papers and great presentations. I have some questions for Ken and also a question for Amy. I actually am having a hard time, contrary to what Alejandro said, I'm having a hard time understanding the distinction between polarization and populism. I'm wondering whether when you're talking about non-populist polarization, you're really talking about a kind of bipolar political system in which cluster around two poles, but which have lots of cross-cutting cleavages. And I honestly can't, kind of imagine a polarized system that doesn't distinguish between the good people and the bad enemies, whether it's class or ethnic or some combination of those. So I'm not quite sure it's useful to pull apart those two things, polarization and populism. And sort of relatedly, I mean, I'm not sure this is related, but let me make the comment. I mean, at some point in your paper, let me say, by the way, this is great. I mean, I'm sounding more critical than I really feel, but at some point in the paper you say, well, populism emerges because people are left out, because the political parties crowd the center, people are left out and have opportunities for to mobilize around the left, the people who are left out. And you regard the United States as an exception to that because the populists captured the Republican Party. This is an empirical point. I don't think it really goes to your main analysis, but there are quite a number of cases that, at least that I'm familiar with, in which it's not outsiders who begin to mobilize around populist themes. It's established members of established parties. Hungary, Poland, those were both established parties. Turkey, Serbia, Macedonia, a series of countries that I've studied. It's established one of the established parties, as in the United States, which kind of captures the populist appeal. I don't think this really damages your main argument, but I just wanted to make the note of it. For Amy, again, I think this is really terrific. I guess what I'm not clear about is how you get from your analysis, your empirical analysis, to the claim that this is polarizing. Because again, sort of as with my comment on Ken, I can imagine a situation in which people are deeply divided over, politics of sexual politics, but are also divided in quite other ways over other issues. So, I mean, can you just elaborate, I guess, a little bit on the circumstances in which these cleavages around sexual politics end up becoming, subsuming or incorporating other cleavages and become polarized?
Thank you, Bob. I have a question as well. I mean, and so for each of you. So let me start with Ken. And I'm sorry Federico is not here today, but if we think of the historical populism, the classical populism in Latin America, it emerged at the time of very deep polarization between capitalism and communism. And populism was oddly enough at the center. Was really an alternative to the big, deep polarization. And even in the Sartori definition of polarization, that's the classical thing, right? And after and then populism disappeared for a while. I mean, there's neo-populism, but I don't think that fit into the characterization. And after the end of the Cold War, when we need to repolarize after the convergence, we rediscover populism, but this populism is not at the center of the ideological divide anymore. It seems to be a polarizing force. So historically, it seems odd, that the same concept has such a strange relationship with polarization over time. And that brings me to something that links to the other two papers, which is what are the decisions of political leaders to polarize and on what to polarize, right? Because, for instance, in the current version of populism, we have, Correa call him populism, but, Kirchnerismo in favor of abortion. And yet the salience of the issues varies by country. Argentina just approved abortion a couple of months ago, less than 2 months ago. I'm currently in Argentina. The country is totally polarized, but not on abortion. Really, that's not the way where Amy, you tell us when it's salient and politicians take two different positions, this is going to be very important, but you don't tell us when it will become salient and why politicians adopt two different positions, given that even in the United States, in the 1970s, Democrats and the Republicans were not divided over abortion. It happens over time, right? So this is certainly a political strategy. It's not that, and so the answer that Ernesto gives to the question is, well, really, this is a demand side, right? So your framing didn't work, Ernesto, because polarization was so strong that it really was more important than the framing. But polarization on partisan identities remains unexplained. Why is that people at certain point in time become so activated? I mean, you have other work where you show that Twitter may intensify polarization based on character positions. But the origin of this polarization is kind of take it for granted. And this brings me back to the first panel where Francisco presented, his work on the role of economic crisis and the increase of religion. That might be an explanation of why people were paying more attention to sexual issues, because if they convert to Pentecostal and they go to church every day, then they're hearing the priest or the pastor every day. So certainly that could be a mechanism, but it's not clear to me what is the mechanism that has converted or transformed populism from being an alternative to polarization to depolarizing forces, and why is that it's on some, I buy your two axes, Ken, but why is that people choose these different axes? Even in the economic one, Bolsonaro really has pretty right-wing economic policies. It's not Orban. He has privatized a lot. Guedes, it's a very neoliberal forces. So even there is variation, I think. So and those choices to me seem a little unexplained. So let me see if there's someone else. Any question from the chat? No. Okay, so do you guys want to answer these three and then we'll do another round? If there's any question from people on Facebook, please write it in the comment sections and they will be sent to me by Monica. Do you want to go in the alternative order, Ken, Ernesto, and Amy?
Okay, sure. Yeah, we have some very, very thought-provoking questions there. Some very good points being raised. First, Alejandro, your question about Venezuela and the spatial dimension of competition and what this meant in terms of the traditional party system. And the argument I touch on it in the paper, and it's an argument I've developed more in other work that I've done, where I talked about the convergence, the programmatic convergence of mainstream parties in the sort of the heyday of the neoliberal era in Latin America. And so and I think even before the even before the onset of neoliberalism, and of course, in the end of the day in Venezuela, it was Acción Democrática that took the lead in implementing the neoliberal reform. So it was one of the cases that I call the bait and switch cases of structural adjustment, where it's not a conservative, pro-business, pro-market party that does neoliberal reform, but it's the traditional, more social democratic, labor-affiliated political party that does it. So I argue that process of programmatic convergence of mainstream parties was especially disruptive for party systems in Latin America. I mean, I basically argued in my work that the so-called Washington Consensus was a disaster for party systems in Latin America. When the Washington Consensus became reified in party systems, it was catastrophic for party systems, and that kind of convergence set them up for the kind of populist backlash that you saw in places like Venezuela or Bolivia. But whether this then is polarization or whether it's repolarization, I think you're right. It's basically a repolarization in a context where the historic distinctions had largely evaporated, and in particular during the period of the economic crisis in the 80s and 90s. But I do think that you're tending to see the populism emerging in contexts where the mainstream has converged. And I think Vicky's point is a very telling one. When you go back historically and you look at the rise of Peronism, and a lot of the classical populism in Latin America was focused on trying to identify a third way that was sort of intermediate between capitalism and communism. And so in that sense, ideologically and in some ways programmatically, it was shooting at an intermediate position. And yet Perón and other populist figures were still highly polarizing in the context in which they arose. And so, but I would argue, I guess, in the case of Peronism, that this is where it was very polarizing in the constitutive dimension that I talk about, but not necessarily polarizing in terms of its programmatic stance. And so even though Perón was doing a lot of redistributive reforms and things that provoked some opposition, but it was not socialism. It was not as polarizing as what a socialist model would be in Argentina. And so it was a case where the spatial polarization was less significant than the constitutive polarization. And then finally on Bob's point, the distinction between polarization and populism. I think, maybe these are subtle kinds of distinctions, and any kind of polarization is going to be separating the political field into binary camps. And most likely each camp will think of itself as good and the other guys as bad. So there's a moralistic element that is likely to be there. And of course, populism always has that kind of moralistic element. So I think any kind of polarization, may be, sort of moving towards some sort of a populist logic. But I think that there's still something distinctive about the way in which, if you go into a Laclauian understanding of the construction of a populist subject and what that is about, and I think ultimately what's really distinctive about populism is sort of the notion of the populist pueblo is always authentic. There's Moody's work and others emphasize they're supposed to be morally virtuous. And I think a lot of the work on Latin American populism, Ostigi and others, they're not necessarily making claims about moral virtuosity. They're making claims about authenticity. It's we the people, we are the authentic. We're the authentic people that represents this political community. And I think you can get forms of polarization on ideological grounds or according to other kinds of social and political divisions that are not necessarily framed in terms of this populist understanding of who are the authentic people who belong to this political, who really represent this political community. But I see your point. I mean, I do believe that that virtually any polarization can probably be framed in populist terms. But I don't think it necessarily has to be, I guess is my point. I'll stop there. Oh, the final point, Bob, on the main, I completely agree with you that we're seeing this tendency for populism to emerge within mainstream political parties and to turn mainstream centrist and conservative parties in a more populist direction. And certainly the Hungarian case is dramatic in this sense, and the Republican Party in the United States. What's interesting is that Trump himself is certainly an outsider. If we were without the primary system in the United States, you can't get Donald Trump emerging the way he does. He would, if it was Latin America, he would create his own personalistic political vehicle. But with the context of the primary system, he's able to use the institutional rules in the United States to take over a mainstream political party. So it's a different dynamic than Orban himself doing it within Fidesz. But it is still, I think, a very troublesome trend when you see the mainstream political parties becoming part of this brand of politics. Okay, I better stop.
So thank you. I am going to provide a different definition of polarization because I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about polarization. So let me present this as a problem that needs to be solved and not as something that I'm solving, and we can argue what's going on here. So this is the relationship between ideology. So this is where I am. This is my left. This is my right. This is where I see Bolsonaro. He's left. He's right. This yellow line is voters that voted for Bolsonaro. And this is voters that did not vote for Bolsonaro. So if I'm in the left and I voted Bolsonaro, I think that Bolsonaro is on the left. If I'm on the right and I voted Bolsonaro, I think Bolsonaro is on the right. If I'm on the left and I did not vote Bolsonaro, I think he's on the right. And if I'm on the right and I did not vote Bolsonaro, I think he's on the left. This is called assimilation. This is called contrast. For me, polarization is this gap, the difference between assimilation and contrast. So that means that there's some people on the left that always see Bolsonaro right next to him. As I move, Bolsonaro never moves away from me. It's always with me. This is assimilation. I can see it not just with Bolsonaro. I can show exactly the same images with Cristina, with AMLO, with Trump, with Hillary. As a matter of fact, just so that it is clear that this is not just populism, this is the same image for Hillary Clinton in 2016, same image for Donald Trump in 2016. I voted for Trump. I see him on the left if I'm on the left, on the right if I'm on the right. I did not vote for him. I see him as conservative if I'm on the left, as liberal if I'm on the right. And with Hillary Clinton, the same. This is asymmetric polarization. The right has a huge gap compared to the left, which is not what you have in the case of Bolsonaro. So we know that the right in the US is more polarized than the left. But it's not because they see the other one more farther away to the left, because they are conservative. It's just the same voter that is on the right is going to see the same candidate as being more extreme if they are voting for them or not. Why? Well, that's where the package of information that has to do with valence issue, which is what we were with Vicky, matters so much. As I change the information, if I want to have a beer, if I drink, if I read certain outlets, if there's things that make him more corrupt or less corrupt, all those things change assimilation and contrast. So when you see Bolsonaro and when you see Cristina, there's no doubt in my mind that Cristina Kirchner is very close to the middle. And I see Bolsonaro, and in the graph that I show you, I can see Bolsonaro close to 6, and I see Lula close to 4, but I see polarization and contrast as huge, way larger than it is. And if I consider Obama, if Obama moves to the center to produce Obamacare, Republicans do not see. They still think that is on the extreme. So assimilation and contrast, and that they're not just simply ideological location, have to do with policy content. They're all the time manipulated by effective responses and by valence packages that have nothing to do with policymaking. So for me, the big question is, what is going on in Brazil? What's going on in Argentina? What's going on in the US, in the UK, that assimilation and contrast have become so extreme? Because the fact that it doesn't matter if you put Biden or if you put Obama and if they're moderates, we still have Republicans that perceive that they're socialists. And what we have is that this effect, the halo effect that Kahneman calls the assimilation and contrast effect, is been getting larger and larger and larger when people are not moving from where they were. So Republicans have selected a candidate that is outrageous, that is immoral, that is a criminal in so many ways. And assimilation and contrast has gone through the roof. But ideology has not changed all that much. It's the same group. In fact, if anything, Trump is in policymaking not more extreme than any other Republican for the last 20 years. So I think that when we talk about polarization and populism, we have to think that the connection has to do with assimilation and contrast, with the package, the valence package of the voters that are making those candidates to be perceived more extreme, and not with anything that has to do with actually extremity in policymaking. Now, to what extent that means that the populist candidate is challenging the elite, the conventional wisdom, the media, and therefore it's actually a policy change, or to what extent by claiming that fake media is the New York Times, then they just increase assimilation and contrast. That's a different discussion. But I have a significant issue on thinking that this connection that we have between populism and polarization is anything that is related to policy content. What I see is huge changes in the packages and huge asymmetry and assimilation and contrast.
Ernesto, would you put the link to that paper in the chat so that I can look it up? So I take I think what we need is polarization with adjectives, Bob. So Ernesto's polarization with adjectives is assimilation or contrasting polarization. I would call, I personally, I think, I would have to read his paper, but I think that what he's talking about is what I think in a lot of public opinion literature is called something similar. It's close to what public opinion literature is calling affective polarization. Though I think it's more of sort of an identity based than really affective, but it's something similar in spirit to affective polarization. But yeah, I was going to respond in go in a very different direction from Ernesto and responding to this question about what is polarization. But again, polarization means so many different things that it's very hard to say what polarization means. We're almost getting to the same problem that we have with the word populism. So how do we get from the empirical analysis that this involves polarization? What I would say is that what we actually see in the empirical analysis is what the public opinion literature would call sorting. So in the public opinion literature, sorting would refer to people increasingly choosing camps based on some particular characteristic. And in this case, so this is effectively tightening the correlation. It's sorting that increases the correlation between that particular characteristic and vote choice, right? So in this case, what we actually see is increasing sorting on the basis of religion. When sexuality politics enters the scene, it's sorting, which is a form of polarization, but not really a form of polarization that deals with extremity. So evangelicals will increasingly choose one type of candidate, and non-evangelicals, or let's say secular voters, will increasingly choose a different kind of candidate when sexuality politics enters the scene or becomes an issue that's on the scene. So that sorting may or may not be associated actually with polarization. I think it often, there's slippage in terms, and I think that they often can be effectively treated as the same thing, but actually that sorting, you may find that there's actually very little difference in issue position between the pro-abortion candidate and the anti-abortion candidate, let's say. But if you find that the evangelicals are increasingly choosing this one and the secular voters are increasingly choosing this one, then you're going to find a tightened correlation between these two, even if they're not that far apart on an ideological dimension. I think you often also find them, yeah, Ernesto's pasted here two links to articles by Liliana Mason. So I think you often also find people choosing more distinct places on the political spectrum, in addition to sorting. But it's not necessarily the case that you will find them taking two distinct, or that they will choose distinct issue, that they will also choose positions that are farther apart. They will sort no matter what. So yeah, and that sorting itself is a way of solidifying sort of the politicized identity. When evangelicals increasingly, if in the United States context, I'm an evangelical and I increasingly come to understand that that means I need to choose Republican candidates, then that is a way of solidifying my identity, the politicized meaning of my identity, which can help in the construction of a populist in-group, right? Vicky, great question about how political leaders decide on what to polarize. So I think this is a really complicated question. My answer would be that in Argentina, political leaders have taken distinct positions on this issue over time. Their positions have also evolved over time. And they're evolving as a response to social movements that are increasingly pushing in a pro-abortion direction and increasingly successful in pushing in a pro-abortion direction, or pro-legalization direction. So it's not that political leaders aren't choosing to take distinct positions on this issue. It's that they're just not succeeding, right? Or that they are not succeeding in polarizing the electorate. They're not getting a response from the electorate when they take those polarized positions. So this is just not a political strategy that is working at this moment in Argentina, I think, in terms of polarizing the electorate or creating sorting. Why is it not polarizing the electorate is an really interesting question. One possibility is that it will, if we continue to find politicians really harping on this issue, they will succeed eventually in creating a base. That could be, we could see something happen that's similar to what happened with abortion in the United States. So the fact that this is happening after abortion, after these like massive social movements, suggests that maybe that's not going to happen. So it's possible, we don't know what the future brings, but for the moment, it seems that this strategy is just not, it's just not salient. And why is it not salient? I would say that probably a lot of it has to do with religious demographics and sort of underlying distribution of attitudes in the population, which have also changed. So attitudes are changing over time, religious demographics are changing over time, and all of these things affect people's receptivity to these kinds of issues. So on the one hand, these issues entered the scene and there's been this massive progressive change, or change in a progressive direction. And there are politicians who are opposing it, but right now they're not finding a base because the electorate is just not responding to their opposition.
But Amy, let me have a two-finger. Gay marriage, it happened in Argentina in 2010. It never polarized. A lot of time has passed. And in the United States, if you think of the 1990s, this was a huge issue when Clinton was president, gay in the military, divided the people dramatically, right? And now nobody cares. I mean, the Republicans and the Democrats don't fight over this. So it might be, the argument that Delia Baldassari and others make, that there is like a secular trend and the Republicans are just arriving late to the secular trend, right? So what we're seeing as a gap is, we're moving towards secularization and people arrive late. So that will be on the demand side. My reading of the I mean, I don't study the topic, but my reading of the Argentine situation, which has more to do with the question, is that I don't think the evangelical leaders in Argentina have so much to win from polarizing, because they might be more co-opted by a party that offers some other issues, whereas maybe in Brazil they did have more to win in the shift towards antipetismo, as Cesar showed in the first panel, and this was a good issue to build antipetismo. But I think there's a lot of political strategy going on there. I don't think it's really about attitudes, because in Argentina, both for gay marriage and for abortion, the electorate was quite divided. There was a majority, but a very thin majority, I think, at the time the laws were adopted. And the laws, in fact, might shift public opinion over time. So it's hard to disentangle the effect, right?
Right. Yeah. There's also certainly political strategy going on. So my sense is that if elites see abortion or same-sex marriage as an issue that is likely to draw votes, they will emphasize those issues, or somebody will try emphasizing those issues. Not necessarily everybody, but some politician is going to try emphasizing those issues. And if those issues are successful ones in drawing votes, they will keep talking about those issues, which means there's a kind of, it's endogenous to public opinion and to demographics, because demographics shape public opinion. So yeah, I don't think that there was anything inherent in evangelicalism in the early 2010s in Brazil that said we are going to mobilize to become anti-petistas, because evangelicals were doing okay under Lula in many cases. I mean, Edir Macedo, for instance, had a lucrative political partnership with the PT. Or lucrative is maybe, it's not, well, there's monetary lucre maybe, but there's, it was a successful political partnership. There was nothing inherent that required Edir Macedo to become an antipetista. But there was a choice that was made that was about, I think, his understanding of the way the political winds were shifting, and changing issues on the political scene that affected his responses. And he saw a chance to build a coalition on a different side of the political spectrum.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Thanks to all the answers. Let's make another round of questions. Anybody? Monica, is there anyone from the Facebook? I don't see anything here. No? Anybody from the group wants to even, yes, Amy?
Sorry, I don't have a raise my hand button because I think I'm one of the hosts of the meeting, so I don't have that. I am really curious to hear Ken talk about the role of moderation in shaping all this. So I'm curious about the role of moderation in two ways. The first is that it sounds like Ken is actually suggesting a causal chain along the lines of Eduardo's, maybe it was Eduardo's comment, somebody's comment. That Ken is actually suggesting a causal chain in which spatial polarization, the potential for spatial polarization, can lead to constitutive polarization. So nobody's occupying the far left of the political spectrum, or nobody's occupying the anti-immigrant part of the political spectrum, wherever that is. And an issue entrepreneur emerges that's like, hey, let's be anti-immigrant to rally some people because nobody's catering to this, this portion of the electorate, or the anti-gay marriage portion of the electorate. So an issue entrepreneur emerges, takes a polarized position, that is like more distant on an ideological spectrum from other parties. And this position, and then constitutive polarization, that is to say, the definition of the pure people, becomes a way of effectuating this, the spatial polarization. It becomes a tool for creating spatial polarization, or for making spatial polarization work in a way. So I guess the first question is, can spatial polarization lead to constitutive polarization? And then the other question is, so the Brazilian case, if we think of, or not the Brazilian case, sorry, the Latin American case that I'm talking about, that we discuss in here, is one in which we posit that it's actually polarization that would, some form of polarization, or at least taking different parties taking distinct issues on a political spectrum where they hadn't taken distinct issues previously. So leftists may start by campaigning for the legalization of gay marriage. And once leftists start by campaigning for the legalization of gay marriage, then rightists take the opposite position on the political spectrum and end up sorting the electorate along these lines. So in that case, it would be that the case, the organization that we're positing in our paper is actually kind of different from the one that you're positing. And it's a case in which polarization, pre-existing polarization, in particular polarization on the left, movement towards in a more progressive direction on things like gay marriage and abortion, can, at least in some cases, create the definition of a populist pure people on the right.
Thanks, Amy. We have a question from the audience that I'm going to read, and then Bob Kaufman has raised his hand. So there is a question for Ken in the audience from Martin Mejia. If populism lies on moral distinctions and connotations, do you think Catholicism can be a key exogenous element that shapes populism in highly Catholic societies like the Latin American ones? So Bob, you're next.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to Amy on the question that I raised. So what I think your empirics show is that when sexual politics issues become salient, either because leaders take a stand or there's a social movement or the courts make a decision, that cleaves the society, that creates a cleavage. My question is, you can imagine two things that would happen from that. One, different things. One, that when that issue is salient, people divide that way, but they divide on other issues in other ways. And when those become salient, you see other kinds of politics. That would be pluralism, in other words. Or, as I think you're implying, you can have a situation in which somehow all the other allegiances and loyalties on other issues becomes either subsumed in the division over sexual politics or kind of merge with them. And then you get a polarized situation. My question is a simple one, which is, can you make an inference from your data about whether this is going to end up in polarized or simply pluralist forms of politics?
Sorry. Thanks, Bob. Any other question before we get back to the panelists?
Virginia, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, sorry, just another.
Sorry.
Another question for Ken, and this is probably just showing my ignorance about European populism, but I always have the impression that in Latin America we see a lot of populisms that go on the market axis, and very few uses of the cultural axis. And it seems that in Europe, you see kind of the opposite. Like we see a lot more on the cultural side than on the state side. I was wondering whether you can tell us something about, is this have to do because the state is still in discussion in Latin America? This has to do with the fact that we have so many ups and downs in the economy that it makes sense that, you know, when you have a lot of money to have left populisms. But even in the times when we have right populisms, I don't know, leaders like Menem were not even on the same scale of xenophobia or racism or like policies for against immigrants that we see in Europe. So is this because we don't necessarily have that, you know, that type of discourse so much, or because, you know, there's enough on the state access to play with that you don't even need to go look for other less, let's say, novel purposes?
Okay, anybody else before we go back to the panelists? I guess, Ken, you should start because there were a lot of questions for you.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of interesting issues here. Let me just say, I mean, maybe I'll start with Virginia's point here at the end. You know, a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper, you know, that was eventually published in Polity as part of a special issue that Ana Jamalabusi did. And I made an argument that in structural terms, and I was sort of comparing varieties of capitalism and grappling with this question: why do we see right-wing populisms in Europe that are tending to locate themselves more on the cultural axis, and whereas Latin America, leaving aside sort of the Fujimori Menem era, where I think there was a window for a certain kind of neoliberal right-wing populism, but I don't think that's a very generalizable pattern. I think the more typical pattern in Latin America has been populisms of the left. And I made an argument for the ways in which dualistic labor markets and segmented welfare states in Latin America and Southern Europe set the stage for populisms of the left to emerge, whereas unified labor markets and universalistic welfare states in Northern Europe were more conducive to populisms defined on the cultural axis in terms of you know, populisms that are trying to demarcate the national community from outside forces that are threatening, whereas left-wing populism in Latin America is set up and in Southern Europe to try to integrate national communities that are divided on social and economic grounds. So anyway, I made essentially a structuralist argument for different kinds of populisms. Now, I did that in a context, it was before Fujimori was elected, but where you could read the winds and you knew that something was emerging in Brazil. So I qualified it because I do think, although I think the structural conditions are not terribly conducive for a right-wing populism in Latin America, especially one that is neoliberal. And keep in mind, as I understand Bolsonaro, he does not come from a neoliberal background. He was quite statist, comes out of the military statist traditions. He ends up aligning himself with neoliberal technocrats, you know, for complicated political reasons. But he himself, and neither is Trump a market fundamentalist. Trump is a neo-mercantilist. Trump is not at all a neoliberal. He's a mercantilist. And so Trump himself has moved the Republican Party away from its market fundamentalism in a way that is very depolarizing on the economic axis. So these things cut in very complicated ways. But I think that the kinds of religious and sexual politics that Amy is talking about, plus the law and order security issues, are tailor-made for right-wing populisms to construct the people in terms of middle and upper class proper sectors against darker sectors of society where, you know, narco trafficking elements and the urban ghetto districts. And so you can imagine, we know how this plays out and how it could play out in Latin America. So I think there are conditions that are conducive to that kind of right-wing populism potentially in Latin America, even though the more typical pattern has been populisms of the left that are trying to integrate the national community where you have these deep social and economic divides. So maybe that addresses some of the issues that Amy was mentioning as well. Let me just say in response, I mean, I think Ernesto's comments are very interesting on this. I would never deny the importance of the valence and affective dimensions of populism and the strength that it has. And indeed, one of the reasons why I set out this three-dimensional understanding of polarization is to make it clear that populism does not depend upon spatial polarization or programmatic appeals. And in my work, I argue there is no specific set of policies, either culturally or economically, that define any phenomenon as populist. I think populism does not depend on programmatic stands. I think the programmatic stands are either incidental to populism or they are instrumental. So they may serve a populist project, but they don't define any particular project as being populist. And as I said, you can have populisms that are not polarizing spatially, that do not take programmatic stands that are any different from mainstream political parties. But I would argue that the more typical pattern, both in Europe and in Latin America, has been for populism to emerge in contexts where mainstream parties have converged either on the economic axis, opening the door for left-wing populisms, or they have converged on the cultural axis. So in Europe, where you see social democracy moving towards more market positions and moving upward in that two-dimensional space towards cosmopolitan positions. And you also see conservative parties moving upward towards more traditional conservative parties moving towards cosmopolitan positions. It opens the door for populists to articulate issue positions in terms of protectionism and in terms of anti-immigration stands and sort of nativist, ethno-nationalist kinds of positions, the same positions you see Trump playing to. I think where mainstream parties have moved upwards and rightwards in that two-dimensional space, it opens the door for the lower left quadrant in particular to be contested by different kinds of populisms. And so I don't think populism is dependent on programmatic appeals or spatial polarization, but I do think we should recognize that a lot of these populist figures are taking positions that are well outside the mainstream. All right, the rise of Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez in contexts where all the mainstream political parties were implementing neoliberalism, and the left populists came along in the aftermath of mass social protests against that neoliberal convergence, and you eventually get you get electoral protest emerging after that social protest. And that's a pattern you see in Southern Europe. It's a pattern you see in Latin America. And so I do think that there is vacant programmatic space. How populist actors map onto that varies dramatically. Whether or not voters think of it in those terms or concept, whether they accurately place themselves on a left-right axis. I mean, these things get very complicated, as we know. So I would never say that populism is dependent on those programmatic appeals, but I do think we should, that we should recognize where that is, part of the political space that they're trying to occupy.
Thank you. Amy or Ernesto?
Go ahead, it's fine.
Okay, yeah, so great question, Bob. I got it more the second time around. Yeah, so the so the question is pluralism versus the prominence of this particular issue. So this is, it's an empirical question in many cases, I would say, whether sexuality politics issues come to crowd out other issues or come to be one issue of many that matters to voters. Empirically, it seems that, and this is, I guess the empirical question is really about the salience of this issue vis-a-vis other issues such as crime, the economy, etc. Empirically, the sexuality politics appears to be highly salient in many of these cases. Whether the rise of sexuality politics issues causes a decrease in the salience of other issues is a question that we actually, hasn't occurred to us to ask in this paper up until now. And it's certainly the one that we could run the tests for. So when sexuality politics issues rise in importance, do views on crime decrease in importance? That's an interesting question that we did not answer. We haven't answered, and yeah, we absolutely could answer that in this paper. I mean, to the extent that people have to some extent limited attention spans, and politicians can only talk about so many things within a given, 20-minute speech. One would think that time spent talking about abortion or gays is time not spent talking about immigrants or the failing economy. So there must be some balancing across these in the attention span of politicians and probably in the attention span of voters. But yeah, we should absolutely test it. It's an interesting question.
So thank you, and just I'm gonna respond going back to something that I think I raised last time, and I always have a bit of a trouble understanding at what point we're talking about polarization or populism and what populism means, because I think last time I said I had significant trouble identifying populist voters. I think if I could get respondents in a survey that say, I'm a populist, then there are a lot of these things that we're discussing that would be way simpler. And I think that the fact that no voter recognizes themselves as a populist and no leader recognizes themselves as a populist tells us a lot about the category. That there's some valence issue in the category that makes it very difficult for me to, get my arms around it. So I think that in part that goes to the assimilation and contrast issue. It's very difficult to understand whether we are the contrast individual here and we're pushing populism to the set of traits that we just don't like, and that we associate those with the kind of voters that we think to have less of the democratic traits that we want. And to that extent, I have significant trouble defining what is polarization, what is this valence trace, what is issue salience, what is it this populist voter that we are thinking about. And I think that's why I come back to what does these categorizations mean? How do we know that there's an ideological dimension is left right? How do we know it's a cultural dimension, given that we are selecting the elites based on those traits, but no voter recognize themselves as being populist, and therefore we are selecting different voters for different movements. So I think every time that we get to this point of the discussion, I'm trying to figure out something that I can ground the discussion on, and I still have significant problems to do so. So that's, I think, my 2 cents on that.
Amy?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that even though I'm using these terms, I also go through the same cycle of questions all the time. And the other term that I have a hard time with is illiberalism as a trait to measure in voters. So how do I distinguish illiberalism in a voter from their polarization and their level of populism? And I don't know. I mean, I have some answers, but it's tricky, it's complicated.
Okay. If there are no more questions, let me thank everyone for a fantastic panel. Let me remind also our audience that we have the final, and of all the panelists, the final part of this conference will be next Friday from 12 to 3 p.m. From 12 to 2, we will have a roundtable of populism, comparing Latin America to the rest of the world, with Bob Kaufman, Justin Phillips, Sherry Berman, and Tim Fry. And then from 2 to 3 p.m. New York time, we will have a keynote conversation with Saskia Sessen and Jorge Castañeda. I welcome all of you to come. There's a webinar that's actually going to have the format of a webinar that's different from all the other panels in this conference. So you have to register for the webinar for attending that one. And I want to thank again Eduardo, Ken, Amy, and Ernesto for a fantastic panel, and the participants for being part of this conversation of what has been a fantastic workshop so far on concepts that we have just learned are not so clear interesting for me, it's not just populism that is not clear. Now polarization isn't clear either to me at the end of this conversation. So I think it will force all of us to think more about how to define concepts. Thanks to everyone for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next Friday. Thanks to the audience in the Facebook Live. Remember, please, to register for the next one, which is in a webinar format. Again, I'm Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. Thank you to everyone.